Gonna go live and
from
just
Earth
we're live
itself
right now.
is built from.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for joining. Great to be here on the fourth day of the Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson, Arizona. Great to be here. I'm hearing some bits of audio coming through there on your end, and I'll hand it over to you, David, if you would like to give a summary, because you're only here with us for an hour due to obligations with the sunset, I believe. Thanks for being here, and over to you.
Yeah, so tonight will be the seventh night of Passover, according to the Jewish calendar. This is the splitting of the Red Sea. So the first night of Passover, the full moon, would have been the Exodus from Egypt, where we actually left Egypt, and then a week later, the Egyptian army gave chase, and God split the sea. So that the anniversary of that is tonight, tomorrow, and it's a holiday, so sundown. It's coming like an hour and a half, but yeah, pretty interesting conference. Today was the shortest of all of the days. They don't have any breakout sessions, and it focused mostly on physics. Today was the physics day, and I could do a screen share if you want to go right into it and go over what they.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds great. I mean, I had a bunch of notes, but they're more technical. So yeah, I'll just add you. Let's see if I can.
Okay, so I'm using two computers again. So
all right. Yeah, just let me know. Just like share your screen there.
Yeah, so I got the screen shared. If okay, so here's the program, and the first one of the session morning today was Daniel Sheehan, Time and Consciousness, talking about the nature of time and the arrow of time related to physics from a pure physics point of view. Interesting, he mentioned that personally he's a dualist. He used the term dualist himself, but said, for the sake of the conference, he would express everything in materialistic terms. And fundamental equations of physics are time-centric. That is, they equally admit time forward, retarded, and time reversed advanced solutions. Natural processes in our personal experiences generally demonstrate a forward directed temporal asymmetric arrow of time. Second law of thermodynamics is thought to underwrite most temporal symmetries. Human and animal precognition are at odds with this standard temporal arrow. Recent quantum laboratory experiments further press the issue. The presentation considers the case for temporal bidirectionality in the natural world and human consciousness, focus on precognition and retrocausation. Also considers the possibility that precognitive effects might be demonstrated by non-sentient devices like informal time machines. It is argued that retrocausation and precognition are not at odds with standard physics, but are in fact natural outcomes of it. Indeed, time may be losing its direction, but not its mind. In fact, it may finally be coming to its senses. So I'm not sure if you got much out of that one, or if you thought he was overstating.
I thought it was interesting to put it together that way. Overall, was happy with all of these. They all gave me some sort of a benefit. It was interesting to see him summarize all of the various paradoxes associated with the reconciliation of the assumption on the level of the gas of inelastic collisions, which is equivalent to time going forward and backwards as being indistinguishable. And this is a definition which is essentially incompatible with another limit, which is the unilateral direction of time. In these, I think he mentioned the delayed quantum choice experiment, and alluding to, or I don't know, maybe if I just inferred it, the idea that these may just be paradoxes of language or misinterpretations on the level of the actual observations. Because if you're presupposing that light is traveling in a straight line, that may not be the case. It may be something you have to infer retroactively based on an observation event. And so I noticed that they mention matter wave traveling backwards in time. I was disappointed because that's not intuitive, and to take these already counterintuitive things in a more counterintuitive direction seems a bit weird, but there's definitely something to be said for causal imminence, i.e. everything happening at basically, quote, the same time, but really it's actually in the same moment or instance. So all in all, the allusions to the time travel stuff, that's not really my interest, but it seems to get brought up a lot in these convos, but I hope that they'll be focusing more on properly calibrating their observations associated with the connections between time and light, which is essentially what this boils down to. So yeah, that one was not bad on the level of what it assimilated for the various paradoxes and such, but the theoretical understanding did not appear to be very high.
Yep. Okay. So next was Paul Davies. It's a large resume, and the time flow is an illusion. Time doesn't pass, selves do. Universal perception that time passes or flows is an illusion. Time cannot change, the world can. Davies tried to demonstrate that the concept of flow of time is meaningless, and instead traced the origin of the impression to the false tacit assumption that the self, personal identity, is conserved over time. This error arises because of the larger degree of mutual information between the self at earlier and later times. The fact that time clearly does not flow in no way undermines the existence of an arrow of time in the physical world, understood as asymmetry in the evolution of physical states in time. Asymmetry of the world in time is not asymmetry of time. The universal perception that time passes or flows is an illusion. Time cannot change, the world can. I shall demonstrate that the concept of flow of time is meaningless and indeed trace the origin of the impression to the false tacit assumption. I guess it repeats here in the booklet, must be a typo there. And I'm not sure he actually demonstrated. He tried to as a big resume. And, obviously from my perspective, the self is non-material. So the self.
What are you saying? He didn't establish that the time doesn't flow, but instead it's just something else?
Well, I mean, what he writes, what he set out to do, I'm not sure he actually did. And I was just pointing out that from a dualist perspective, you could say that the identity, the self, doesn't arise from the material and does in fact remain the same over time, or is unaffected by time, and that you could say time affects the material realm but not the spiritual realm. But he took it purely materialistic understanding and assuming that there is a self, and presumably that the self arises from the physical. So if that would follow his perspective that the self can't remain inherent whole, but at the same time, from a non-dualistic perspective, the self is actually a dualistic concept that he like I was mentioning yesterday, he would actually need to establish that there is a self to say that the self doesn't remain the same over time, which is
I think he was just alluding to whatever correlates of the self existed within the body, and it seemed to be saying the body was some sort of a memristor or storage device for the various. Basically, it seemed that he was saying that the impression of a flow of time, the idea of a flow of time, that's a subjectively arising, non-objectively existing, if there is such a thing, phenomenon.
Well, he uses the expression personal identity, which would.
And when seculars refer to that, I take that to mean corporeal representation.
Yeah. So next,
I'm looking to agree with people basically. So to me, it's uncontroversial that there's a massive element of the quote mind, without actually going into what the connection to the mind is between the mass and it.
Yes, it was pretty interesting. Penrose, unfortunately, was tech issues. Almost felt sorry for them. Like, I mean, I guess he's a pretty old man. He just couldn't get his stuff together, and it was almost like unbelievable that he couldn't figure it out. Like, obviously, Nobel Prize winner coming up with some of the most complicated theories, but just like a boomer tech, you couldn't figure out how to unmute or screen share, and even to follow commands to be explained how to do what it needed to do. So it was almost embarrassing. I guess also kind of expensive to pay for the conference. They had a tech issue like this, but I guess they'll re-record it and post it later. But as I mentioned before, that they post it anyway. So so Penrose was missed, unfortunately, for that. You had any comment on the boomer tech there? Or, did it make sense to you that like Roger Penrose really wouldn't be able to figure that out? Is it just an age factor? Is he suffering mental decline, or is it just natural, like a boomer, no matter how smart they are, can't figure out how to do these things?
I would say it's a confluence of factors. His advanced age can't be a good thing. I doubt it's the sole factor. There was a strong vibe of people not really ever having to deal directly with technical issues at it. So
it could be he always has other people do it for him.
Quite a spoiled vibe. Unfortunately, when people cannot deal with tech, it does come across as a bit out of touch with regular everyday folks.
Yeah, so that happened. Okay, so the keynote was the Israeli-American Avi Loeb, best-selling author, professor at Harvard, wrote a popular best-selling book on extraterrestrials and over 800 papers on various topics. Is the science theory director at the Breakthrough Prize Foundation. And, there are a lot of questions. He spoke for a while. The search for extraterrestrial life is one of the most exciting frontiers in science. First tentative clues were identified close to Earth in the form of an unusual interstellar object, the Oumuamua, an unidentified aerial phenomenon in the Earth's atmosphere. The recently announced Galileo project ushers the new frontier of space archaeology in search of extraterrestrial technological relics. This lecture will feature content from his book Extraterrestrial, as well as the textbook Life in the Cosmos, both published last year, 2021, and regular material he writes for Scientific American. And then there was a long Q&A. A lot of people they directed the discussion like advice to people trying to get a science education today. But it was interesting, the state of extraterrestrial research and the claim that there is some stuff that is worth looking into that could be material that isn't likely to have came from natural processes. And he was mentioning the price and the difficulty of sending things, and for humanity to collectively decide that it would send like $1 billion probe just to try to collect evidence of possible existence of something extraterrestrial, not made by natural process. Not that they're necessarily contact with extraterrestrials, but likely relics of extraterrestrials. And then there was the long Q&A, more about various topics such as physics and science. And I guess he does funding and various things, that he was a popular speaker to have a lot of questions too. So do you have any comments on Avi Loeb?
I unfortunately missed most of it due to the time difference, being slightly tired. What I saw was cool, but I only caught like the end basically with questions. So sorry about that, but I caught everything else.
Okay, yeah. So I don't have anything more than that to say, but it was interesting. Like, people check it out when they post it. So next was the origins of life, plenary. They had some University of Arizona speakers, Dante Loretta, oversees a lot of projects. It was talking about testing theories of the origin of life using samples from near Earth asteroid Bennu, which Bennu was a specific asteroid that had carbonous materials on it. And, so him and some of his colleagues in these labs have been testing it and comparing that to see if these carbonous materials could have conceivably been building blocks for life. Going over various things like the protein world hypothesis purports that proteins are amplified in the presence of any genetic function. And just various analysis or things that we could garner about the origin of life from the few samples of carbonous materials on asteroids. Also, he mentioned the orchestrated objective reduction hypothesis proposes that consciousness preceded life. Consciousness in this theory is driven by self-collapse of the quantum wave function, producing proto-consciousness moments that could have driven organic molecules to self-organize. The first molecules to enter the quantum coherent state may have been polyaromatic hydrocarbons. These hydrocarbon rings occur at the core of proteins, nucleic acids, and psychoactive compounds.
That's a bit hard to follow, isn't it?
Yeah, they're investigating quantum effects in the chemically complex macromolecular organic material that likely contains the bulk of Bennu's carbon. So did you catch that, or have any thoughts on these carbonous materials on asteroids and the implications toward? And I don't necessarily take that approach towards the origin of life.
I was very impressed with that one. I like the approach a lot, for sure. The emergence, and then the image I said that looked like a light bulb. That one.
Well, and then you mean the Sarah Walker one? No,
Sorry, I
so
just
what
want to
she
make
was
sure.
doing.
Am I thinking of the right one, or are you still on the one before that?
Well, I'll move to the next one then, because I think you're talking about that. So yeah, I found this one pretty interesting, and I even saw. So you could see Sarah Walker has been on Lex Friedman. People can check that out if they find some what I'm about to tell you interesting, if they haven't heard of her. So at Arizona State University, where Hamarov is, they have the Emergence Center led by Sarah Walker, who spoke, motivated to uncover the fundamental principles explaining life, including its origins. And there's a lot of publications, and I haven't looked at a few papers. So hard problem, life and consciousness, understanding what is life and by extension how it originates may be the most difficult open question in science, rivaling only the problem of consciousness and its potential difficulty. Both seem to bend our current understanding of physics and chemistry as ill-equipped to solve them. This led to the notion of the hard problem of consciousness, meant to precisely articulate the key feature of consciousness our current understanding of reality can't explain, the problem of experience. That is, why does it feel like anything to exist like consciousness? Here I argue that explaining life can be similarly be reduced to a single focal hard problem, the hard problem of life. That is, how can information affect the material world? And discuss new developments in a theory called assembly theory, aiming to address the problem. So I'm not sure I'd heard of assembly theory, but I found it very interesting. And I even looked at a few of her papers. So did you want me to go straight into assembly theory, or did you have something you wanted to say about Sarah Walker?
Well, I have notes on the assembly theory, but I can wait till the end of the presentation.
Okay, so here's an article she wrote for, or co-authored for Frontier Magazine, Intelligence as a Planetary Scale. Let's look at the abstract real quick. Conventionally, intelligence is seen as a property of individuals. However, it is also known to be a property of collectives. Here we broaden the idea of intelligence as a collective property and extend it to the planetary scale. We consider the ways in which the appearance of technological intelligence may represent a kind of planetary scale transition, and thus might be seen not as something which happens on a planet, but to a planet. Much as some models propose the origins of life itself was a planetary phenomenon, our approach follows the recognition among researchers that the correct scale to understand key aspects of life and its evolution is planetary, as opposed to the more traditional focus on individual species. We explore ways in which the concept may prove useful to three distinct domains: Earth system, exoplanet studies, anthropomorphically sustained studies, and the study of technosignatures and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We argue the explorations of planetary intelligence defined as the acquisition and application of collective knowledge operating at a planetary scale and integrating the functions of coupled planetary systems can prove useful in framework understanding possible paths of long-term evolution in inhabited planets, including future trajectories for life on Earth and predicting features of intelligently steered planetary evolution on other worlds. So she actually didn't talk that much about this. What she talked mostly about was assembly theory. And then she also talked, pretty interesting, of all the people about interdisciplinary studies, and mentioning like consciousness probably has to be studied on the level of chemistry, but the level of biology versus chemistry versus physics, and the interdisciplinary nature. So that was interesting, and those were just kind of overviews and their own research into assembly theory. So let me just read this other: identifying molecules as biosignatures with assembly theory and mass spectroscopy. Encourage people to read this also. The search for alien life is hard because we do not know what signatures are unique to life. We show why complex molecules found in high abundance are universal biosignatures and demonstrate the first intrinsic experimentally traceable measures of molecular complexity, called the molecular assembly index. To do this, we calculate the complexity of several million molecules and validate that their complexity can be experimentally determined by mass spectroscopy. This approach allows us to identify molecular biosignatures from a set of diverse samples from around the world, outer space, and the laboratory, demonstrating it is possible to build a life detection experiment based on molecular assembly index that could be deployed to extraterrestrial locations and used as a complexity scale to quantify constraints needed to direct prebiotically plausible processes in the laboratory. Such an approach is vital for finding life elsewhere in the universe and creating de novo life in the lab. And so, very interesting, this assembly theory is just looking at the formations of molecules. And I guess, she didn't go over the exact technique or algorithm that they use, but that there would be some sort of stability structure where you could predict the simplest structures. Some of them could be replicated in a lab on a simple level, but was mostly using computer generation. And the theories held that outside of biology, you're not going to get things much more complicated than 15 atoms. And there's some materials, but it's saying that of like a organic structure, that random processes could only lead to about 15 atoms. And say, for example, ATP is 21 atoms, and that you have to have biology arise or possibly question how did you get from 15 to 21. Was it just a random process that happened once and then get caught in the system of life, and then life was able to uniquely process molecules that couldn't happen in natural processes? And so this, looking at it molecule by molecule in simplified forms, is that they examine over 700,000, is called assembly theory. So I found that particularly interesting, and it looked like a new form of research, and it could also and just what is life on a chemical level, and what's the unique element of at least looking from the size and complexity of the elements of life, and if they can't become about through natural processes, how did they come about? Or so it was a pretty interesting way of looking at it, and encourage people to look into it more. I posted her talk with Lex Friedman. If
Do we actually have an explicit definition for information that she's using?
You'd have to read the papers. I mean, she didn't go into that much details of their method in the presentation.
Mm-hmm. This was the one where it was mentioned that information takes control of matter. Is that right?
I'm not sure if she used the expression "take control," but it was a informational approach to life, and that was the point from information theory of the complexity of the molecules necessary for life. Like I was mentioning, that they hypothesized that 15 is about the maximum that occurred at any stage during the Big Bang, and then whence like the cell or the precursors to a genetic material like protein synthesis or RNA, DNA, or whatever the earliest molecules were, that there was a process that was able to overcome the information limit and create larger molecules.
Well, the idea also was focusing on the fact that these individual building blocks of life are really not that complicated. I think there's a mention about 7 carbons. And if you look into these basic amino acids, I'm not talking to you, David, I'm sure you know what they are, but the audience, if you're interested, you'll see these are very simple molecules, basic building blocks of protein and so forth.
Well, that was the one thing I remember was after about 15, they don't occur naturally.
Do you remember when they said matter plus information equals time? That was interesting, but they also said that complexity is proportional to the time it takes to form. So the time seems to have been switched there in terms of its causal powers. And as soon as we realize where it makes sense to put time in the emergence thing, it has no causal powers, we'll get a lot farther in the understanding and be able to fold some of these definitions, i.e. superposition and entanglement, into each other for certainly, if nothing else, a lot better understanding of at least what these experiments are doing in the first place. But yeah, was this the one where they mentioned the RNA world map? I was just remembering what you said yesterday about the evolutionary T-jump perspective and so forth. Was this the one where they mentioned the RNA world map, about how RNA was supposedly pre-existed DNA in terms of life forms?
That may be the next one.
Yeah, okay. Another thing I noticed I liked from that one was that they were talking about the speed of time. I would say it's the rate. So if you take time out of it, what you're left with is a rate, and then you have a frequency which can apply to sound, light, and basically anything happening cyclically. So that takes time out of it. Doesn't mean time's not operating. It just means that we suck at understanding time for the same reason as consciousness, for the same reason as light. They're all bound up together in how they act on what we're calling our individual self and our individual consciousness. Another term I really liked was assembly space, because that gives it a real geometric intuition, at least on the level of the term. So anyway, that's where I was at with my notes on that one.
Okay, and the last one of today, Steen Rasmussen from Denmark. Assembly and evolution of minimal living materials. Systemic protocell design process is a starting point for exploring two fundamental questions: how many minimal living systems emerge from non-living materials, and how many minimal living systems support increasingly more evolutionary richness. Living matter as a minimum is composed of a metabolism that transforms energy to support the involved reactions, generate building, an information system where inheritable information that at least in part controls the metabolism, and the container that co-localizes the metabolism and the informational system. Further, the system exists in an environment that provides resources and free energy as well as absorbs waste. We present an example of a protocellular system that satisfies the above. Lunder's principle states that the ability to copy and evolve information costs free energy. Therefore, available free energy must be a prerequisite for replication to occur, and thus the existence of a metabolism is a prerequisite and converter of available free energy into the work needed in replication. Good molecular candidates to support single metabolic processes are complexes of polyaromatic hydrocarbons and metal. Informations in modern life usually referred to sequential information, while composition information is a less restrictive form of information that can also be replicated. To show how compositional information can be coupled to a metabolism experimentally, as well as assimilation in context of the minimal living protocell. By examining data from systems in physics, biology, engineering, economics, it turned out that one can observe two different modes of evolution or optimization and expansion. The former may occur in systems whose size and component interactions do not change substantially over time, while the latter is a key property of open-ended evolution, where components and component interactions change over time. Thus, to enhance the evolutionary richness of a system that only optimizes the above presented protocellular system, the system must be enriched with new components and thereby interactions to expand its potential dynamics. So they've applied this simple design idea with some success to enhance the behavioral richness both for computational and experimental investigations, but is only in retrospect one can be certain which system expansions one should apply.
Yeah. It's really interesting to see how these experiments are bringing people back faster to the issues with the assumptions of the methodological assumptions and how they affect experiments. It does seem that there's only a narrow range of assumptions that are well understood with regards to how they influence progression and interpretation of experiments.
Yeah, so tomorrow's the last day of the conference. In the morning, theories of consciousness, neural mechanisms of conscious visual perception, then putting theories of consciousness to the test using intercranial electrophysiology and causal manipulations. Then the keynote address, David Chalmers, From the Matrix to the Metaverse. And then the afternoon, quantum neuroscience. So you have from Google, quantum AI, and 3 different talks about quantum neuroscience. And then there'll be breakout sessions at afterwards, and that will be the end of the program. So the breakout sessions tomorrow: representation and perception, psychedelic and altered states, subcellular correlates to consciousness, another one on space-time and consciousness, and healing in altered states. So
Yeah, there wasn't too much mention of drugs today. That was kind of nice.
Well, they have it partitioned, like the program where they focus on one subject the whole day. So I mean, yesterday they put together panpsychism and psychedelics. I guess they didn't have enough for one whole day on panpsychism and psychedelics, and then during the breakout groups they had other stuff that wasn't specifically related to those two topics. But yeah, I mean, generally the day has a theme.
Did you think today's was better than yesterday's?
I'm not sure better or worse. And yesterday they had those sound issues that were really made it difficult to listen to the main sessions. Today, obviously we missed Penrose, but besides that, they're all interesting as things, interdisciplinary studies. All of these topics are related to and important for an encompassing theory or model of consciousness. I guess like in physics, like a theory of everything, it's more a search for fundamental axioms where other things could be derived, as opposed to consciousness needs to explain so many different phenomenon. It's by nature, has to incorporate all of the major disciplines.
Yeah. Did it seem like they got anywhere with figuring out what it would take? Because it really didn't seem like that to me. It seemed like a lot of people talking past each other, and I mean,
Yeah, so David Chalmers was the main guy, framing the hard problem and what it would take to solve. And now he's talking about, the simulation and metaverse. So instead of going back to a solution, like he's saying, like maybe there is no solution or whatever. Why now he's talking about, the possibility of being a simulation.
that's not really new, is it? I mean, that's been going on since Kurzweil wrote his book.
Well, I'm just saying that that's what Chalmers is focusing on, the one philosophy expert among the scientists who was framing the issue. So instead of framing the issue towards a solution, he's actually like putting a rod in the spoke or whatever to so it's interesting that that's Chalmers' direction these days, and that's the keynote he's giving on the simulation, and some sort of hint that they don't really have a good roadmap towards the solution or the direction of the research. There's just a whole bunch of research in a whole bunch of fields. Sometimes the various advancements in the fields have significance to other fields, but that's about it. Like I don't think there's much more. I don't think there is no real major theories of everything in terms of consciousness at this point.
And what would it take for there to be one, in your view?
Well, I mean, be like on Kirk Draimunga, if you said you're instead of saying proposing a theory of everything, you're proposing like a like a Gödel type. There can't be a theory of everything, and for so consciousness, yeah, I think it'd have to come from theology, and it's probably like I argue with T-Jump. It's a matter of religion and meant to be unknown. If dualism is in fact the answer, and there's a hard limitation on how much we can know about the non-physical realm. So in that sense, that we may not be moving any closer towards an answer, although there's advancements and better understandings related to the material realm and interaction and a delineation of the non-material realm, that we're not really moving forward on the aspect of that from the spiritual perspective, the body's a limiting factor, and it's not in the problem of empiricism means that we can't actually solve this problem.
Right. So it sounds like you've presupposed your own conclusion that it's an unsolvable problem, thereby rendering you absolutely deaf and blind to any possible solution or form of a possible solution. It doesn't really seem like you've thought through what your acceptance criteria are for a model that you would consider good enough.
Well, I didn't say that that I was that's generic. What sages have been saying for hundreds of years, and saying you could have advancements, but like a theory of everything, a model that explained.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like evolution to me. Slow advancements, but nothing ever really happens.
But evolution's more a direct theory of.
Your thing's a theory too.
Well, I didn't advance it there. I was just explaining framing the current understanding. I didn't even necessarily advance any theory. It's saying that the concept that we're not going to get any further is a well-known school that's been around since people have been talking about the issues or the limits of the
Yeah.
empiricism
And has
problem.
it occurred to them that that's a self-fulfilling prophecy?
No, if they're just saying that that's a hard stop rule, and you
Have
could
they
put it.
considered that that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy?
It's possible, but I don't. I think you're
So if they have
misunderstanding.
considered it, would they have concluded that it is one?
No, I mean I think you're misunderstanding the concept. I mean, some of the Kabbalists will put it in terms of approaching the infinite. So saying like consciousness is like the infinite. It can't be described properly in in a finite terms, and because it's infinite, the progress to be made towards solving it is nonstop. And so just saying like hypothetically, you say, well, maybe you could reach infinity. Um, you're saying, well, that's possible, but the general framing is that we think that's impossible, and so we're expecting continual progress, maybe more rapidly or less rapid in different eras or periods.
Well,
Theologically,
no, you're
maybe like
presupposing your own conclusion and making a self-fulfilling prophecy through self-deception.
it's not my conclusion. I'm saying that's the I'm not I'm giving overviews of different ways of looking at it. So it's a school of thought that I probably fall into that school of thought, but it's not really my opinion.
Because you don't think you have an opinion.
Yeah, I don't really have an opinion. I just fall into a school of thought that's the school of thought I'm into, and it's I would say one of the major schools of thought on the issue.
You cut out for just a second there. I didn't hear you. Sorry.
You see, it's also one of the major schools of thought on the issue.
Presupposing unknowability with regards to consciousness?
Or complete knowability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And similar to like God, just saying that there's limitations on human potential, and the solution to this question is something beyond the limitations of human potential. And if there's like
And
a soul factor or
putting a limit on human potential by asserting your own conclusion.
well, you're not putting a limit. You're just you're saying that
well, if asserted limits are
by this.
self-fulfilling prophecies, then yeah, that kind of is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, you're just unnecessarily framing it in that way. If you insist on doing it,
I'm not framing it in any way, shape, or form. I'm putting it in an objective way.
I mean,
I'm
you're
trying to show
using the
you
word
that what you're saying
prophecy.
it has a frame, even though you think it doesn't have a frame, that it's not possible to have something without a frame. But we don't have to go into that right now. We can just talk about whatever it was you wanted to go over with regards to the conference.
Well, that was about it. So,
So basically, you have no idea what it would take to accept. You have there is nothing you would accept a unified field model on consciousness because of theological reasons.
I said there's nothing. I'm saying if it worked, like if there was a
But
model and it worked,
working is completely subjective. You have to actually state your acceptance criteria in order for me to go and say, well, here it's working and establish that. But if you just say, well, it works, well, that's meaningless. That's like saying it's useful. That's meaningless.
well, I say at this state, there's not really even anything on the market or frontier. They're saying so setting criteria it's unnecessary because there's so many precursory steps that need to be worked out. So you're saying if there is eventually a theory that explains everything, so be it. But at this point, there's not really even any proposals, and to set guidelines for what a theory would look like. That currently, it's more likely that there is no such theory, and then to set the guidelines as an explanation why there's no such theory. But say no, you can't close the door on it. We're just not at that point in research or time. That's not on the horizon. There are no such models, and when you try to set the guidelines for what an answer might look like, you're more likely to have limiting factors that would preclude the possibility of such a thing. So it's not like a
Sure.
prophecy or something
That's,
about like what's going to happen in the future. Like, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. What I said isn't, it's just the current prognosis.
right. But consciousness studies always talk about self-fulfilling prophecies. So in my understanding,
I
there
don't know
is
why
no
you keep on
difference.
using the word prophecies, that like making predictions or something like that, or why that has to
You just
even,
made a prediction that there's not going to be a model on consciousness and that there isn't a model on consciousness.
it's not a prediction. That's the current prognosis.
I'm sorry, I thought you said that it wasn't going to happen for quite a while. It wasn't in the foreseeable future or something to that effect.
No, I'm saying the research will continue, and if there's advances that are unforeseen, like so be it. It's not a prediction. It's saying a current prognosis of the research is that there's hard limitations on what we could know, making it unlikely that there's going to be some sort of comprehensive model. That may change. It's not a prediction that that's always going to be the case. It's just that that's the current state. If things
Have you ever
drastically,
heard of the maxim that you can't find something you're not looking for?
I don't know why you keep on pushing it to like this issue that like that no, people are looking for it. They're not finding it. And I'm not saying that people aren't going to keep on looking for it, and saying that
Well, they're looking for it on the materialistic side. They may not find it there. They may not find it the way they're looking at it right now. But
there's all
I
sorts
would
of
say
people looking at it from all sorts of angles.
right. And is that why we don't have any answers?
Well, presumably we don't have we don't have we have a lot of answers. We don't have a comprehensive answer, and saying we don't have a comprehensive answer because possibilities, like there is no comprehensive answer, that it's even impossible to have a comprehensive answer, or just that it's a really difficult question and we're so far from a comprehensive answer that we don't even really know what a comprehensive answer would look like.
Well, I guess if we're going to ask T-Jump, he'd say novel testable predictions. But you didn't even say that. So you just basically said there wouldn't be anything. So your position is unfalsifiable under your view. I think if you can't name the criteria for what you change your mind based on.
Well, I changed my mind based on evidence, and that's just my position. It's not
But
even
how you understand the evidence, like your position informs how you understand the evidence.
possibly. I mean, default, you're going to have a position. You're going to fall into a school That's the school I've fallen into. Because it matches my theology.
Yep.
But the research goes on, and my school doesn't really matter in
Well,
terms
if you're saying what you're saying is only because of your theology, and I'm going as far as I can to agree and taking as many precautions to negate the bias of theology. It's kind of hard to get
you
onto
don't
the
have to
same
agree.
page.
It seems you're barking down a worthless point. Like, you could disagree, it doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, I don't want to disagree. I guess my intention is not to disagree. I don't know about the actual words of it. I consider the words to be less important than the process, which is why I always focus on the ideas. But I think you and I don't sort our ideas out the same way. So that's where the communication breakdown is. I don't think it's on the level of intentionality. So I think that's where a lot of the success comes from.
Yeah,
But yeah, I love this image here of the, it just reminded me so much of the Big Bang, but it was actually starting with the planet Earth. The emergence at ASU was starting with the Earth. And I like that. And what else did I have? I brought up these articles, but I guess you already went over them pretty much. So if you want, I don't know if you had anything else to say or if you wanted to wrap up, and I can yell at the audience for however long. Just kidding. Overall,
okay,
so
great.
far, has it been worth it for you? Like, are you thinking the investment? I think it's been great. It's been awesome to just see Hammeroff and all the other people who've been following. It's been great.
Yeah, honestly, it was probably not worth the money, because the videos will be out in a few weeks, and they didn't really take any questions from the remote. There was barely any interaction. There was only a handful of people that were writing in the chat. And as I said, they released the videos in a few weeks, anyways. So, in that sense,
Do you remember the catty comment from the guy who said not to type in the chat and it was distracting and something? Remember that one?
yeah. And like, obviously, you don't even have to have the chat open. In fact, the default is the chat is closed. You have to click to open the chat. So,
Yeah, so in terms of like cross-disciplinary collaboration, that level of passive aggressiveness to like go to the trouble of opening the chat to say that the chat is I'm sorry. That's not a good use of your mind. Maybe, just saying. But yeah, it would have been nice if there could have been some kind of conversation. But what happens is like people get into these, wishful thinking modalities where it's like, I love the universe is love. And then at that point it's sort of, it's nothing to sort of say, no real direction to take things. And then people aren't used to talking about consciousness. So it causes all these horrible triggerings and friction and bad behavior a la rat utopia. So I'm only saying it because identifying the source of awkwardness can sometimes make it a bit better and more manageable. And yeah, understood that on the level that it needs to be to actually craft models that may one day be predictive enough to pass the smell test.
yes, I mean, okay, I support the cause. I gave money to support the cause. It may not have been bad to have given money to to the conference to support the concept that people are researching it. But I would say it was a bad use of money, in the sense that they released the videos anyways, and there wasn't really any advantage to watching it live. That that if I watched it 2 weeks from now, even though it was recorded and released later, that I didn't feel like I was part of it, or there was hardly any interaction. And I mean, at least I had the chat open. So I would say, like, from that perspective, it wasn't worth the money, largely because they released the videos a few weeks after, anyways. But I'm not upset because, like, I wasted money, because I feel like I'm supporting something that I find interesting. Like I'd like that people are researching and putting thought into these topics. So in that sense, I supported a cause that endeavor that I value. But So I'm not upset that I spent the money, but at the same time, I don't think I don't think it was worth the money.
Do
That
you
if you
think
just wanted,
networking would have been more worthwhile?
yeah, so if you wanted to support what they're doing, you could pay, and okay, we were there, we saw it live, and we supported what they're doing. But like, no, there's really no big advantage to having seen it now as opposed to a few weeks when they release it.
I guess I thought they took a couple months to release it last time, but you know,
It might have, but she said they'll release it in a few weeks. But even if it's a few months, that I don't think it was worth paying to get the information now. There wasn't like that much groundbreaking, like release of new research. It was mostly, it was latest research, but a lot of the research was from the last few years or even decade. So like a few months really wouldn't have made a difference. And I'm not sure if there's stuff that they could have done. Really, it's up to the people like us that were in the chat to communicate or create some sort of community. And I think there's really only like less than 5 people that regularly commented in the chat, and then there might have been another tens of people that made one or two comments, but it was just a handful of people, and it wasn't intensive or that like deep conversation. Even that, it was just kind of random factoids or things that people put out with a tiny bit of back and forth between a few people. So I guess I'll sign off, and you want to enjoy rambling. And tomorrow's the last day, and we'll see each other Sunday night for week in review. I'll try to write another small article this week, and I'll probably write something up on the Science of Consciousness conference or the direction of Science of Consciousness research. So hopefully I'll have that by Sunday. So have a great weekend, and I'll sign off. Oh, Jennifer's there. If she's muted or she's not there, I'll wait till she says something to sign off. Maybe she stepped up, but see that she's muted. Maybe she stepped up. Yeah, well, she's still muted, so just so there's not dead time if she's going to go on her own. Yeah, it was interesting research. There's a lot of different fields. I'm not sure if Jennifer signed off. She had some sort of computer issue. Now it's just me here. I'm not sure if hopefully it's still working on her end, or she'll be back in a second. So I'll stay on just so it doesn't end the stream on her. If I'll wait till she comes back and then I'll go. So yeah, it was pretty interesting. There's a lot of research being done. There's a lot of various fields and advancements in those fields, and a lot to learn. And so much of consciousness focuses on the brain, and even dualists like me who don't think consciousness derives from the brain. Clearly, the most felt place physically of consciousness is the brain, and if it's the neural correlates of consciousness. And so there's just a lot to learn about anatomy, and like the Walker was saying, consciousness probably happens on the chemical level. I think the periodic table, but you have organic molecules, and besides the philosophy and theology. So there's just a whole host of important topics, and obviously a model that will be predictive in a scientific way will have to be reduced to mathematical equations or series of differential equations, and that predictive in the scientific sense usually means or always means mathematical equations that so it's exact predictions. And although there's some mathematical models, statistical models, they're far way off from that. So are you back, Jennifer?
Anyway, thanks for doing that. I had about probably one too many tabs open there. So I appreciate you rambling before I came back. And I hope it wasn't too awkward. I heard most of that. Probably missed about a minute.
Okay, great. So as I said, I'm going to try to write up something
There,
on the conference for
oh yeah,
Sunday. So enjoy the
there
rest
was a
of the
question for
conference.
you in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to take it, but it's up to you. It's direction of the world for the next 10 years.
Yeah, it's a maybe as we can review. I mean, if you're just talking like the science of consciousness research, there's so many factors: the world, politics, economics, let alone just the direction of the science of consciousness research for the next 10 years. So I'll let Jennifer ramble on that. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Well, it's going pretty well so far. The Science of Consciousness Conference. We've got one more day, quite a long day. Looks like it's 10 and a half hours from 8:30 in the morning till 7 at night. So I can say what I think is going to happen in the next 10 years, but I actually have no idea. Because a lot of stuff, it's just so much stuff up in the air right now. It's about as close as we could ever get to a chaotic system. I.e., what's going to happen in the future is largely being decided right now, so making predictions is hard. Dark Matter and Battle Rap says they hope I can make a documentary one day. I would be very bored at at such a prospect. But, stranger things have happened. I'd rather put the time towards something more educational. So maybe I'll just talk a little bit about how I understand consciousness. So, in my worldview, consciousness is fundamental, and then there's associated pedagogical trappings that understand that that's just a completely unrelatable thing. There's scriptures written even about people basically coping or attempting to cope and failing, but with the difficulty of conceptualizing of these transcendental concepts. And there's even a way to figure out, deduce what the transcendental concepts are. Is anything that is unlike ourselves is going to be hard to draw an analogy. And that's essentially how we learn through analogy, or you could think of a metaphor as a sort of perfected type analogy, and then language as a set of these corresponding sounds to something else that we don't really have access to that absolute nature of matter. So come at a problem understanding, there's these things that are, for a lot of known reasons, not inconceivable, but there's serious limitations on conceiving them, and we have evidence of people erroneously conceiving them, and if you're not hypervigilant, you're basically doomed to erroneously conceive of them. Anything fundamental, like consciousness, would be such a thing. So I'm trying to imagine how someone would be first thinking of panpsychism and why someone might want to reject it, possibly because it sounds like the universe is conscious as one entity. That's not what I'm saying. The manner in which that is true or could be true, I don't really think translates to English. So I don't even want to talk about that stuff. I just want to talk about materialism. But because panpsychism is true, it does have to be, consciousness had to be mentioned at least as the thing that's being removed from the methodology. And that's why I was glad to see in the presentations, these information-centric approaches, because my whole approach could be described as informational. So it's like what your standard approach is a thermo right now, only we can be a lot more explicit on what the microstates are. Because right now, a lot of these approaches basically run into a problem where, I mean, there's basically no way to tell the difference functionally between even major branches of science that we'd think would be different, but at the end of the day, what are we distinguishing on the basis of if it's just an interpretational thing? And so you have to be ultra careful when incorporating concepts that are counterintuitive. So the way I'd look at it is like, we'll list the concepts in terms of how intuitive they are. And I would even include a category that's just completely unintelligible and admit that that's just a personal opinion. But if it's unintelligible to me, like, and I can learn it, okay, that still counts for something. May not be the only, not the deciding factor, but it's something. So what is this stuff actually telling us? Well, it's the thermometer thing I keep mentioning. What does it mean when it's 30 degrees versus 25 degrees? No one's going to disagree that it's warmer when it's 30 than 25 and so forth. There's not any disagreement to be had on that level. The question, and where it becomes difficult, is interpreting why it's possible for there to be that variation in the first place. Why can I build this thermometer thing that changes the level of mercury based on something that seems to correspond with heat, what we can all refer to as warmth and so forth? And as I've said before, I guess I was just a broken record at this point, but Boltzmann really wasn't that long ago. He forwarded a new understanding. How much did he really say, and was his theorem just another version of quantum mechanics, but looking at matter on a different granularity, perhaps? And so the point of a diagram like this is to contextualize what it is that science is actually telling us. So when we can make a conclusion about a finite system, i.e. something we represented with a thermometer-like thing, closed system, how that then analogizes to the non-closed or infinite case is far from self-evident. And it's not just something you can brush over in your reasoning. It actually has to be meaningful. And what I'm coming around to calling non-trivial self-reference, which is extremely difficult to visualize, but luckily there's really only one version of it, and that's 3 plus 1, the non-trivial self-referential manner in which 3 plus 1 arise. And by doing that, incorporating that on the level of the measurements themselves, you maintain the perfect accuracy, but you don't have to sacrifice the flatness. Or, sorry, you don't have to sacrifice on the level of informational detail. So there was a conversation earlier in the chat, which I don't think the other person really understood, as to why presuming that time is somehow able to be switched from the forward and the backwards direction, and that those would be the same thing. That's fundamentally misunderstanding what time is. Some things can only be positive, like apples, for example. So time's like an apple. You can only have plus apples, you can't really have minus apples, and if you do, it's kind of a trick of language. So back to, yeah, consciousness conference. Great time, but ultimately just very concerning about, and I hate to say recklessness, but really it can't overstate the importance of being respectful of pre-existing knowledge in these domains and resisting the urge to play God. I'm sure it's quite appealing, but it has been done before and it has gone so badly. So start with yourself, do your own self-improvement. As that journey advances, you'll feel less compelled to try to control other people and in trying to do these weird things that lead to the idea that it's proper to interfere with how other people are thinking and their own autonomy. At what point does one make the conclusion that they're rightly justified in telling people how they ought to think? So perhaps just something to take on board. Delocalization and superposition are, I don't want to say the same thing, but superposition is a mathematical version of delocalization. I'm sorry. Entanglement, delocalization, and superposition are all super connected. Super connected. And hopefully over time I'll be able to make that more clear as to what exactly that means. And I was working on this earlier. I'll just show this real quick before I wrap up. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the tetractys from, I guess it's the Greek period. And I guess it wasn't self-evident that that shape is also present in the quantum mechanical periodic table. So I did a little diagram there. So this thing here would be considered, there isn't really a word for it. I suppose you could say it is a super space-time event, and that it is either proto-conscious or the ground of consciousness. And that's, in my understanding, what I've tried to do is give a mechanical representation of consciousness, so consciousness as a process, that accords with the language. Now, that's really hard to do because we have, soul, self, personality, ego, tons of different things that, what's the right word? And I guess consciousness, observation, those two seem the closest. And this thing is never really observed. It is what gives rise to observations. So the thing that gives rise to things isn't the thing. And this is a word game a lot of people try to trip you up with, and perpetual justification, the principle of sufficient reason. Yet another one of these presuppositional matrices, and used by people that just basically don't want to talk about actual ideas. Want to make it look like you don't understand your own ideas. That is just going to lead to a bunch of complications and distinctions where there really ought not be any distinctions. So here you can see on the level of the periodic table, there are real distinctions that occur, but there's really not much. And the distinctions that do occur are in a lattice of non-distinctiveness. So the distinctions within the non-distinctiveness, that's the real challenge of physics, but just measurement in general. And so this is what is meant by panpsychism when I say it. And I know there's a lot of false attributions as to what that means exactly. And I'm sure in some cases it's intentional. People just don't want to change their minds at any cost. in which case it's just a matter of identifying and profiling rhetorical tactics, which obviously has already been pre-done. So, just a thing to consider. And the question is, how do we go from this to actually applying it? Because it isn't clear how, and this is the sort of question I'd love to hear rather than nitpicking, which is useless. How does this turn into a model for consciousness that can actually be applied day to day? Because it's pretty and it's interesting numerically and geometrically and gives sort of a lattice from which other shapes can arise. But it certainly doesn't tell you anything about how to live your life. So that happens through strategic interpretation and in many ways already exists in pre-revealed systems. But you can certainly start here. Generalize the principles. As you can see, there's principles of symmetry, principle of entanglement, which is connected to symmetry. What's the simplest way we can understand symmetry? Is just our own body has approximately an axis of symmetry, same information, repeated on either side. Okay, that's like your basic example of self-reference. Self-reference means what? Well, there's two ways to look at it. One is informational redundancy, and one is a fundamental ordering principle, which is like a pre-directionality. So starting in the middle of a sphere and moving towards the perimeter, and the instant where you're turning around towards the center again from the boundary, that's a metaphor for self. Hopefully this isn't too repetitive or boring, but all this geometry can then, by iterating it over and over and over and over, generalizes new principles. And so we can say, well, least action principle works great here. So we can also assume that it works somehow on the level of my own consciousness. And that where it seems like the least action principle isn't applying, it actually is just in some unseen way. So there's always just a matter of time before it's discovered that there's going to be a least action principle, aka expansion of microstates simulated along a boundary spontaneously. That's just a general principle. And since we're dealing with bounded systems, we're talking about a perpetually expanding system with a boundary that is fixed. And so the system is perpetually expanding to the boundary, then bouncing off it, then expanding back to the boundary, then bouncing off it, and existing within a very, very, very tiny interval of potential. Hence why things get modeled as these boundary conditions. Because it quite literally can be deduced from demonstrable principles that all the information is going to align in the least action array, which just happens to be this relative to one center, something maximally far from the center, but also respecting whatever temporary boundaries instantiated itself around it. And so on and so forth. But if you continue on with this reasoning, doesn't even take that much more. And in fact, I went over it recently. Like, I don't know if the person fully followed through, but I can just reassert it here. This would be your material simulator. And the key characteristic of a simulator, other than, I suppose, order of implementation, is motion. It can generate states. And so we are like this in that we generate states as well. And this thing just, the states that this thing generates are stoichiometric states, so chemical reactions and so forth. The states we generate aren't chemical reactions, but that process is a metaphor for what our process of consciousness is. So we look at chemistry really closely and say, well, universal mind did that, and universal mind based on chemistry is mediated based on products, light, reactants. Okay, so you have a basic trinity structure. Great. And take that, generalize it to the human organism. which is like the QMPT, and then say, well, its processes are also mediated by light, except that the light in chemistry, it's fixed. It's static because it's completely absorbed in a bond. We call that like a static field, I suppose. Life is not a static field, but it's approximately static. And just like the temperature of the planet Earth is approximately the same, but technically it's going to have a tendency to get a little warmer. And that's just because time has gone by and more energy's come in. Even though the planet's really good at diminishing the effect of that incoming energy, still more energy. There's always that little extra. So this thing's a simulator using light. We're a simulator using light. But we have a standing field. Whereas chemicals, subject to reactions, don't have the same kind of standing field that we do. They have one field, and that's the one that holds their electrons in the arrangement that it is. That field is subject to change, but it's essentially a non-local field. Life has a local field, i.e. your thoughts are locally yours. There's an energy corresponding to the processes in your mind body. The periodic table is a simulator of future possibility, but there's no separation for it. There's no separation between its simulating the states and the collapse into the states, but for the light. So the light simulates the exchange between chemicals, and then they settled into their products phase. So reactants, reaction, electrons move around. What pushes the electrons around is photons. Again, this is not my stuff. This is secular stuff. And then once the reaction's over, there's still pressure in between all the electrons. We can't establish any evidence of the pressure, but it's part of the model because we need a potential to do work intrinsic to the system at any point, commensurate with chemical reaction. So continuing with this metaphor, it would be that we are a localized version of the periodic table. The periodic table is finite, but in its actuality is delocalized because an element, uranium, is no more true in one quadrant of the universe or galaxy than another, right? The truth of this thing is the potential for the periodic table to exist is the same everywhere. It doesn't get actualized, but it's always the same. So we are like this, and this is like the universal mind. The manner in which we're like it is that we exist as a single thing. The information in us is structural. Signals are transmitted through light. And fundamentally, change can be said to be a simulation, i.e., a bunch of potential things, a bunch of ingredients mixed up together. Now, what is being simulated? The future, at the very least, the present. The body simulates the present using the recent past. And it will also simulate the future. And on and on. That is your basis of maybe the sub-ordered thinking. Not all thinking is ordered. We have this superego type thing that we can start to order things, but even that's highly flawed. But this is a description which has been made taking into account the fact that, in my understanding, okay, there's just no way to get access to this. Like if someone took me down the garden path of the infinity questions of how do you know, it would just be like, there's an end to what can be known, because what can be known is a subset of what it is known to not be knowable. If that helps at all. So something like feelings would just not be knowable. The fact a feeling was had would be knowable, but the informational content of such would not be. All of these things wouldn't be considered to have causal powers per se. It would be more along the lines of something said as an explanation or justification for something that one was unable to face some fundamental aspect of. I suppose you have to step out of the belief that your own chatter, your own existentialist chatter is worth much here, and just look at it mechanistically. I don't think anyone can disagree, however, that there's a simulation of what appears to be at least what's directly in front of us through our eyes, and more. But that information is somehow anchored to space and time, namely, what can I expect to happen in the future? What is the meaning of what is happening in the present? Simulation. Using a bound light, which I call entangled, because it is bound up by the skeleton into a single structure, much like this one, but not as symmetric as this one. And so can put forth its own simulations. So level 1 of the simulation is just present and future possibility. And the next level would be an orderer, which increases the accuracy of the simulation. That would be your I am. And so the point of simulating I amness is better quality memory. And the point of better quality memory is an evolutionary edge. So you can reach the cogito from a simulation imperative. And we can put words to something that is normally subvocal. And to do that, it helps in a number of ways. Probably the best one is there's less room for self-loathing, because there's an equalizing effect between people where there's really no reason to have self-loathing when everyone else has the exact same flaw as you. Does that make sense? And it's not really a flaw in an absolute sense. It's just an attribute. Attributes can become problematic when they're not acknowledged. So, yeah, I just want to say thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and hope this was valuable and that was a helpful explanation. Normally, explanations like that I would not give, because it's like I don't think necessarily anyone's going to understand. I'm happy to go through it if someone actually gives a shit. But most people, I mean, who gives a shit? It's not that I don't care. I do care. I love this stuff. I love going into it just for experience. I know most people don't care, though. So the point of that is you don't need to care about the bare bones of it. You can apply the technology by just saying, okay, the I am is a simulation Okay, so what? What is the effect of that on my day-to-day life? And the answer is you can use it for a variety of things, variety of effects that have been established to work. And it's scientific in the sense that you can validate it, but you have to actually apply the technique. If you're doing it without the associated intention, it won't work. The intention is the basis. So someone in the chat says that they maybe don't have an infinite amount of self-love at all times, brimming and ready to go. I think it's pretty standard to deal with that. I mean, there's a lot of, we're in a very hypercritical society, and it's really rough. And I've heard a lot of criticisms, and I know the intentionality behind them was they wanted to help me, but it's still really, it was, it didn't hurt per se. It hurt that they were saying it. It hurt that someone else might hear that and actually take it seriously and be crushed by it. And it just hurt that there was like no desire to share. And it seemed like there was a choice between criticism and being happy. And the choice was always to criticize. And, okay, fine. That the intention is, oh, I just want you to be better, blah, blah, blah. Well, okay. But then that incentivizes a situation of, well, why would you want to, why would you want to talk if it's just going to be pure criticism and everything is just always basically what I'm saying is that it doesn't feel good to have your I am simulation assaulted. And that can happen. And if you start to get to know yourself better, you'll understand what your triggers are. And it won't be any more feeling bad and frustrated for no reason. It'll be knowing exactly why you're upset and having way more understanding and patience with yourself because of, I think it's a combo of like seeing what it is in its own terms as an existential frailty and not something that you should be expecting yourself to like not have to deal with. And also seeing that everybody else has that same exact frailty and that the amount of intentional hurting going on is not very high. It's more a habituation. Habituation to a belief that criticism means caring about somebody. And I guess what I'm saying is that sort of goes against my theory on consciousness and undermines the foundation of the self-image to be subjected to constant criticism. And this may be an unpopular opinion that that's actually not a great thing. So the theory, I think when it's properly understood, the conclusion is, well, let's make the existential simulation as good as it can be. And what does it mean for it to be good? It doesn't mean for it to be hedonistic, because hedonism is only pleasant for a while, and then there's the drop of the chemicals not being there anymore. It's, oh God, need more, Addiction is more like what it is. So there is a great deal of peace to be had in asserting what limited control there is over the simulation of consciousness. But to believe that it can be controlled on a level that it can't be is to fundamentally set yourself up to have a lot of suffering. So this methodology is a step-by-step way to actually get freed from beliefs that you're currently imprisoned by, but you can't see them. Because according to the system, it's not possible to know the contents of your beliefs. Why? Well, because they're sub-vocal. Why? Well, because most of what we experience has no sound. Because what has sound has symbols, and most meaning is not symbolic. So yeah, all that to say, I really like my new diagram. And yeah, like, thanks for sharing, Dog Pluto. I think a lot of people can relate to that. I've definitely had moments of being extremely angry at myself. And that's fine. The I don't know. The way I would look at that is an opportunity for self-improvement. Everything is sort of an opportunity for self-improvement in my worldview. And it gives a lot of resilience. I was trying to find this gift that I made. Oh, here it is. There we go. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, so being alive is really rough and an ongoing struggle. And I think this methodology can help with that because it gives you access to building your own metaphors and having a small amount of complete knowledge is tremendously comforting. I would go as far as to say more comforting than a lot of superficial knowledge. Yeah. We could probably all stand to improve a bit. I know I could. Yeah, maybe I'll just mention this thing one more time about the temporal invariance. Cart before the horse there. Very important. Intuitiveness, goes a long way. Not everything is subject to not a decomposition. So when we say something like it's time can go backwards, when we think of time going forwards, we're already subjectivizing the hell out of it. So then to add it going backwards, you're taking what's probably a cognitive bias and adding another cognitive bias by adding a direction to it. And that would be considered not a good idea. Time, as far as I understand, is always positive. Time can cause evolution and de-evolution. Now, evolution happens almost never. Evidence for that, the evolutionary record. There's not that many different species throughout time. That's macroevolution. The way to tell is that there's actually been a physiological change. Drastic. So some functionally, on the level of the information, to use a term from the conference, it's become more dense. It's doing more. It's taken a leap forward. That's the quantum mechanical state transition one that's really hard to visualize and hardly ever happens and would basically involve a mother giving birth to something that would not be the same species. But there's also devolution, which is domain-specific adaptation, which is what we are now calling, well, mostly we're not calling that evolution. They're not opposite processes, but it is accurate to call one evolution and one devolution because in devolution, there's a fixation of potentiation because you get the big step in evolution, which gives you a bunch more access to information. And then based on the environment, microstates get simulated and they become adapted to the environment. So they're fixed in a dependence relation with the environment. Now you can call that evolution, but I would say it's more of a devolution, aka an assimilation into the environment. What am I up to? Verond. I am on day 4 of a consciousness conference, which I'm pretty excited about. Because at my old job, I used to go to conferences all the time, and honestly, I miss it. I miss it a lot. So going to this one, even though it's a virtual conference, on a subject that is really only tangentially, ironically connected to what I look into, but I've certainly cited the head guy, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, many times in my talks. So it's pretty great to be able to see him in this conference. Because I've definitely, like, without him, my quantum mind hypothesis would be, that would be really hard. I would be basically completely, it's the opposite of the Emperor's New Clothes. It's like the hobo screaming a new physics and metaphysics simultaneously. Completely unrelatable, I'm sure. Did I find anything interesting? Well, I've got a bunch of notes here. Stuff is interesting to me when other people are getting a benefit. Stuff's interesting from a pedagogical angle. And I know consciousness is absolutely never going to figure prominently in any theory on physics. That doesn't mean that panpsychism isn't true. So what would be interesting for me would be to make a reconciliation between consciousness being really hard to visualize to the point of it being impractical to put in a practical model, but also understanding that it needs to be under the hood, processed relationally. Otherwise, we're going to get some serious problems in interpretation, which is stuff like the consciousness conference and just the general trends lately in understanding of physics are going, where a lot of these concepts can be shown to fold into each other. Like, really, what's the difference what's the difference between superposition and entanglement and non-locality? Well, entanglement is a bunch of stuff crunched together. Non-locality means stuff hasn't been distinguished as a single dimension yet. And if the only thing being resolved is space, well, a lot of these concepts, they're not synonymous. I'm not saying entanglement is synonymous with superposition, but they're not synonymous, if that makes sense. There's an overlap in their definition. And that's why I'm suggesting a traditional approach to a subset vocabulary where we strategically pick terms that accord with a standard decomposition. We'd say, well, it doesn't actually make sense to talk about such and such until we've talked about these other things. And hello, Germania. Thanks for showing up. So in terms of what I found interesting, I find fascinating, like wildly interesting things all the time. And it's hard for me to talk about them because it was like interesting to the person I was talking to, and I was really into it for them. Then to turn around and say it here, it's like, well, I wouldn't even know if people would be into it. Hopefully that's not too confusing. Delocalization is a big one, though. That is pre-geometric. Okay, so we have space-temporal. That's the emergent one. That's the last one. Prior to that, we have something kind of geometric, process relational, and we have even pre-geometric thing. And as we go back and back and back, those are harder and harder and harder to visualize, but you have an increasingly large scope of what you can predict with it. So it is almost like those beginning of the course things where the professor takes you into, what are the numbers really made of? And then it's like, ooh, and then you sort of like, okay, well, thank God we don't have to open that Pandora's box again. Only this time, you have the option of remaining in the state of extreme uncertainty. So delocalization would be some type of all-encompassing thing, and local would apply to any observable. And so we have our spatial observables, our temporal observables, but then we also have space-temporal observables. And those are all subject to delocalization and localization. Delocalization arising with localization, those two things being inseparable, that's probably the hardest, like the actual forming of the bubble. To process relationally that to localize a boundary is equivalent to to the things within the boundary existing in a superposition, which is delocalized. And that itself being a condition of measurement. Brand asks, what can be in a delocalized state? So a state is sort of the whole thing. And then delocalization would be a property of something defined within the state as having a boundary. And this is not new. If you look at how physics is currently understood, it's all closed system. So I'm going to say a boundary because I'm actually making a geometric argument. There's 3 + 1 boundary here. But the idea of using a boundary in physics is arguably no such thing as unbound physics at this point, because everything is simple systems in quantum and closed systems in thermo. So just to be clear that issues of conceptualization, issues of whatever with these models are never considered valid criticisms unless a better model can be presented. And that better model has to actually be better. And when a model predicts everything, it's hard to find something better. But be that as it may. Generalizing. We have a system. This is how to think about it. You're starting with something and you know absolutely nothing about it. Zero. You don't know anything about it. And you're coming into it and thinking, well, what's the best way to parameterize or chunk the system, break it down, such that it makes sense? And there's an answer out there, and not really accessible in any direct way. So we have to get these halfway things, halfway ideas that have more concordance with the out there objectivity, quote unquote, than others. Localization and delocalization go together. And the best way to understand this is the electron. It's the simplest thing. And I wonder if I actually have an atom sitting around somewhere. I made a image of an atom. Those of you who've been following may remember I was playing with a AI machine, AI image thing. So, okay, atom. We all know what an atom is. Let's look it up. Okay. What's a good image to illustrate delocalization? Superposition, delocalization, non-locality, that's all the same basic thing. It is entanglement, or I'm trying dependent arising. And it is something we talk about prior to measurement. You can still have entanglement after measurement, but it's a different entanglement. Measurement breaks entanglement. All right, I'll use this one because I can't really think of. Okay. There's just like really not even a single good one that is actually making the gonna make the point. Here it goes, the closest I can get. All right. So the one on the right here. When we're talking about an atom, let's just only look at the green bit, not the purple bit, and just pretend it's just a single electron and pretend it's just hanging out there. All right, so the electron doesn't have a position that is, the position of the electron is somewhere inside that sphere. It's not defined what it is. It's smeared out within a particular, quote, volume. That's delocalized. It doesn't mean it stretches out to the edges of the universe. It means that within the range over which its radius is defined, there is no single position it occupies. It is understood to exist in all the positions, and that the next step would be to localize it into a subset domain of the total domain of position potentiality. So so we have a localized entity, an atom or an electron. Think of it how you like, just anything, single identity. A localization to a single identity. It's not localized in space, it's localized as a concept. The localization of that concept then delocalizes the associated information within the shape of the concept. So it imposes something like position on the system, but that's not position, because we're doing an arising model that starts with literally nothing. So we start with nothing, and then we go through a hierarchy of ideas that you can stack on top of each other, increasing complexity. And the power of a system like that is that if there's an error, you can just go down, down, down to whatever level, even the bottom one, where you have nothing, no suppositions at all, and just build back up to figure out what the error was. So position is definitely, I would say superposition is something, or delocalization is something we understand in terms of position, but it is not itself position. We can analogize it with position, and we should, but just always keep in mind that our judgments on space and time are not good. We shouldn't trust them. I'm not saying we shouldn't use them. They do give information. It's just not, if you just assume that not liking an idea is grounds to dismiss it, then you're not taking the right information from the idea. All right, so I'll do another diagram here for the idea of superposition. So what I've done is one step at a time. You start with waveform. What's that? It's like a balloon. Okay, what's that? Well, it's like a circle. So a circle, we start a lot of the time with a circle because it's sort of the simplest bounded system you can really make. A point doesn't work because it's not a system, and a line doesn't work because it's not bounded. So if you have a circle, that's simplest bounded system. Let me say push down and you get a reduction 1. Now, what does reduction 1 do? It pumps up A2, A1, and A2 at the same exact, not time, but just think of it as a step-by-step process. A2 comes up, which causes a reduction in R2 and R3. Okay, now these things are obviously going way too fast. All right, and I didn't have this ready at all, but the point of this is that this is not time. This is a process. The time will come up after. And where time comes up is like, you almost have to wait till the experiment itself comes up and then say, okay, yeah, that's time. Because everything else is like in advance of time. So the more you can do in advance of measurement correctly in terms of interpreting what the dimensions are what the entanglement of the dimensions is, i.e., what is reasonable to expect your system to do as a result of the measurement you're about to do to it. And understanding that a reduction is not localized within a system. It is a superposition. And the superposition is kind of like simulation, because the animation of the varying states, because within that boundary that we keep looking at, there's no privileged position like the first depression of R1 for reduction. That's on the top right, but that could be anywhere. So it's not about getting, it's like, I guess I'm just like sounding like a broken record here, because I haven't really fully gone through every last step of it to be able to understand it. And that's because I need somebody to talk it out with me. Because obviously my understanding, the way that I approach things is just not, it doesn't necessarily line up with other people's thought process. So at this point, all I'm really working on is getting ideas, so that on their own, people will start to converge to the same conclusions as me. But, I'm not in a rush, because to me, the conversations we had now where the understanding is low in a way are, I don't want to say better, but they're very interesting. And it's a chance for people who maybe never understood something or thought about it to open the door for the first time. And I guess I just really like being a part of that. So happy to be part of the Science of Consciousness conference. And yeah, I'll wrap her up for now. And thanks to all who tuned in. We'll see you Sunday for Week in Review. Bye for now.